In the Buddha's Words, an anthology of discourses from the Pali Canon, edited by Bhikkhu Bodhi. The Pali Canon, from what I understand, is the oldest works of Buddhism. These are the oldest recorded teachings of the Buddha, written still hundreds of years after his death. And at the time, the monks would orally recite and memorize the teachings until eventually they were written down into the Pali Canon on, I believe, a bunch of leaves. It is safe to say that this is the most genuine and authentic core of Buddhist teachings, the earliest work of the Buddha. Think the Quran or the Bible, right? This is kind of like the complete Buddha's words. Anything after that is just additions made by others or maybe more local stories and stuff. These are 5 things I learned from this book. Now, just as my background, I've lived in Japan for about 6 years. I currently live in the United States. I talked with a lot of people who were Buddhist, and frankly, the religion always confused me because people's beliefs in Buddhism seemed always so different depending on who you talk to. And recently I've done some more research into Buddhism. I think Buddhist teachings are getting a lot of limelight in the West right now. Because I didn't really understand Buddhism, I wanted to get more information about it, so I decided to read this book. And it is really interesting, and this book will definitely give you a thorough understanding of Buddhism. It is very challenging to read, but it's also like reading the New Testament. A lot of the core Christian beliefs are right in the New Testament if you're able to read that. Number 1, Buddhism is a religion. What do I mean by Buddhism is a religion? For example, in the West, there is a movement of secular Buddhism, or even meditation, where people are taking pieces of Buddhism and shaping it to fit their life. But really, Buddhism is a faith-based religion. There is a combination of faith with logic within that faith structure, as well as religious knowledge and just spiritual beliefs. For example, one of the core pillars of Buddhism are the 4 Noble Truths, which, to summarize, is the Buddhist belief system of life is suffering. Suffering is caused by craving. When you put an end to craving, the suffering stops, and the Buddha has shown the path that leads you away from craving and suffering. Now, that's all well and good, but that is actually just a belief system. You could also have a belief system which is common in the West and Christianity, where suffering is an essential part of life and a means for you to grow, and in which case suffering is meaningful, and the removal of suffering is not necessarily the purpose of life. So that is the fundamental belief system of Buddhism. There's also the Buddha's role within the path, and he is almost deified within the religion. It's a little strange because the Buddha is clearly a teacher, but the way people talk about him, they've kind of converted him into a god. It's actually kind of odd because you go to Cambodia or Japan and you see thousands of Buddha statues, and sometimes they're gigantic and people go there for worship. So they're almost bowing to Buddha. But that said, originally he was a teacher. But unlike just the normal enlightened, he is the capital E enlightened. He is not just any enlightened. So it's a little bit hard to reconcile that, but yeah, there definitely is a spiritual belief within the Buddha and his role within his plan. There's also the wheel of life, reincarnation. So there are plenty of things you must believe to be fully accepting of Buddhism. Now, if you just want to pull a couple things that are good for you, maybe, then that might be more secular Buddhism, where some beliefs are pulled from, but the spiritual beliefs are kind of just pushed to the side. But then you're actually not believing in the original Buddhism teaching, which is shown in the Pali Canon. There are also gods within Buddhism, different levels of afterlife and past spiritual work that has been performed. It's definitely more than just a logical or secular belief system. Number 2, actions taken are similar to other major religions. For example, there is an emphasis on developing virtue, disciplining your cravings, which another word could be passions. The cravings is a little bit more thorough and specific. Just like Islam or Christianity, there are great teachers, there are Buddhist philosophers, there is a community of believers, there is a form of heaven, which in this case is enlightenment, which is almost like a return to the universe, where you leave the cycle of reincarnation and suffering by becoming one with the universe. It's actually pretty fascinating. There is a specific, and I say very specific, path to walk to reach enlightenment, where I think in Christianity and Islam, there is a very specific path to walk. Like, you do this, you'll reach heaven. And when I was in Japan, people would always, there's a famous metaphor in Japanese, there are 1,000 ways to reach the top of Mount Fuji. And that is kind of the approach people took with Buddhism. But if you actually look and read at the Pali Canon, which is the original teachings of the Buddha, he very specifically lays out a path. Like, this is the path, the eightfold noble truths, the path. And even in the end of this book, the Buddha says, hey, there are other paths, but they are not my path. This is my path. So in those ways, the actions taken by the believers are very similar to other religions. Number 3, Buddhism has its own focus or flavor. Not in a bad way, of course. The focus within Buddhism is self-training and mental training, which is probably why it is very popular in mental health, because mental health or mental stability within Buddhism is one of the core teachings. Like, you must learn to calm and control your mind. Whereas that emphasis, you can find it in other religions, but I don't think it's nearly as strongly put forward as in Buddhism. Another major difference is reincarnation versus resurrection. And unlike some of the other religions in the world, there are many deities within Buddhism, but they're almost like demigods, not full gods, because they also are trapped within the cycle of suffering and rebirth. Because Buddhism has a lot of mental training within, it's also somewhat scientific, I would say, which is probably why it curries favor in the West. Because the Buddha's like, hey, your mind thinks like this, and let me give you examples, and what if this happened and this happened, then your mind thinks like this. But the goal is to quiet the mind by doing this. So it's kind of like a logical framework within there, which people can use as the foundation, because I think a lot of people are scared of belief these days. So the Buddha will give you a little bit more logical path to think, at least when it comes to meditation or mental strength. The spiritual stuff is just purely belief. You either believe the Buddha is the capital E enlightened one, the Tathagata, or you don't. So there is definitely belief there. But it makes sense that some of this more scientific, logical based reasoning would be popular over here. Number 4. Enlightenment is a fundamentally different goal, though in my opinion it's also somewhat confusing. I think we're somewhat familiar with enlightenment, nibbana, where you cease your cravings and you're just one with the world and you leave the cycle of rebirth. And in a sense, it's not like you go to a heaven or you return to the cycle of rebirth. You just stop being in the cycle entirely and you just kind of fade into like, it's an abstract topic, of course, right? Because in like Christian religion, there are literally people that have gone to heaven and come back and say, hey, like for example, Jesus Christ or God. So it's very different. Whereas the Buddha is like, I am enlightened now, but like what happens when you're enlightened and you die? Like you kind of just like leave the cycle completely. And also enlightenment is a path that takes lifetimes, right? So there are people that have done past spiritual work or have past accomplishments and they are closer to enlightenment, or they are now able to become enlightened within this lifetime. Very different from our belief system in the Christian or Western religion, where like this is the life to learn and to grow and to follow the, God's teachings. Whereas within Buddhism, like, it might take you multiple lifetimes. It's kind of incremental. And I will say the theology within Buddhism is vague, but it is vague by design. Like, the Buddha purposely strayed away from getting too much into the gods and also philosophizing within about like what it actually means to be this or that. There's actually a little story within the Pali Canon about that. So in that vein, it's a little vague what exactly some of the details can be. It's a little confusing because the appeal of enlightenment is strangely not that appealing, because you cease your cravings, which also means like you let go. That might not be appealing if you have a family. Like, for example, the Buddha abandoned his family to pursue the spiritual path, which I don't think was too unusual back then, but for a lot of people, just abandoning your family to focus on the spiritual path would be a lot. But within Buddhism, there's monasteries and shrines and the ascetic life, becoming a monk. Those are like letting go of worldly attachments, and it is really hard to do something like that. Giving up your cravings is almost like detaching from the world, whereas Christianity is very different. You remain in the world, but you're not of the world. Like, you don't become worldly, but you still partake of the world. Whereas Buddhism is like letting go and ceasing the cravings for everything. And then you could be like at total peace and suffering ends. And also, because there's no heaven system, it's kind of up for debate. Like, if you become enlightened, is that really better than staying in the cycle of rebirth? Because you might just cease to exist entirely. So this is more of the philosophy that doesn't get covered in the Pali Canon, which I'm sure there's other Buddhist philosophers who have gone more into that. One last thing is how to get enlightened is a little confusing, because there's the Buddha's path, the eightfold noble path, and there's all these states and maybe past lifetimes of work. But also for some people, the Buddha will give a sermon for 3 pages and it says like 500 people became enlightened. So it's almost like an instantaneous event, which is a little confusing because I thought it was a path, and how do you know when the path ends? Like in the Western religions, the path ends when you die and then there's judgment. Whereas Buddhism, you can just become enlightened, and then yeah, it's just a little confusing. It's a little hard to conceptualize, and maybe it's more of an individual thing, and there's no really like perfect answer. So I think Buddhism has some wiggle room there. Number 5, the West takes mental health, but Buddhism is a lot more than mental health. Now, mental training and meditation is a part of the Noble Eightfold Path that the Buddha taught, which unfortunately is not really emphasized or taught very well within Western religion. I think there's a lot of anxiety for those who are into Western religion without having a really deep understanding of it, because Western religion is coming to a relationship between God and finding peace within that, as well as like striving to be the best you can be and forgiving yourself and asking for forgiveness if you can't reach that. The Buddha's path, detachment from clinging, is almost like detachment from anxiety or expectation, guilt, which is very appealing because a lot of people struggle with these strong negative emotions. So the Buddha's teachings have a strong element of self-care for our modern society. That said, Buddhist teachings have a lot to them. There are the past lifetimes, the rebirth, the cycle, the wheel of life. There is a long written history of Buddhism, many teachers, many works, many stories, and sometimes the stories can get pretty mythological, I'd say, which is fine, right? I think that's pretty normal when you have stories that come out about the Buddha, right, who was alive many years before the stories were written. But Buddhism also has some of its dirty laundry too, so like every other religion, it has some dirty laundry. And Buddhism has lots of regional variations in beliefs and separate gods, and some people, if you ask them, believe Buddha is a god and some people don't. At least my experience in Japan. But the Buddha taught a lot more than just mental health. The Buddha definitely taught a system of morality, such as being truthful or honest, making the right choices, the right kind of life, becoming a part of the community, and a lot of other things like other religions have put out there. The full Buddhist practice is more than meditating and taking care of yourself. There's a whole lot of other stuff out there. And those are 5 things I learned from in the Buddha's words. Now, this was a complicated book. I'm sure there's many more Buddhist texts out there. There's also a lot of modern Buddhist philosophy, I'm sure, as well. And I probably messed up some of the pronunciation of words and maybe even some of the concepts, but this is just my take. And I took a lot of time thinking about this, so I think I'm pretty good here. Let me know what you think below. Buddhism is a really interesting religion to me. That said, I'm Christian, so I have a different way of thinking. But this book definitely, one of the big benefits is it helped me appreciate my Buddhist brothers and sisters out there, right? Like we're all people trying our best every day. So it made me appreciate their belief system. All right, have a good one. Thanks.